A waitress walks into a mafia boss's wedding, and the whole room freezes. Not because she's beautiful, not because she's famous, but because the necklace she's wearing, a phoenix carved from black obsidian, is something the world's most powerful mob bosses thought they buried with a mysterious woman 15 years ago. And in that instant, Rowan Vale, a 26-year-old woman working 3 jobs, becomes the most wanted woman in Blackridge. This is her story. Watch to the end, hit like, and comment with the name of the city you're watching in. Let me know how far this story has come. The storm hit Blackridge the way bad news always did, without warning and all at once. By 7 in the evening, rain was hammering the streets hard enough to blur the city lights into long, wet smears across the pavement. Rowan Vale stood at the service entrance of the Vescari estate, her collar soaked through before she even made it inside, and she was already 40 minutes late because the bus that was supposed to take her across the Meridian Bridge had broken down 3 stops short, and she'd run the rest of the way in second-hand heels that were half a size too small. She pressed her back against the stone archway, trying to catch her breath. Her name badge was crooked. Her mascara had probably run. She didn't check either. She was thinking about the electric bill. $42 short. The shutoff notice had been sitting on the kitchen counter since Tuesday, propped against the sugar jar like an accusation. Her brother Eli was 14 and doing homework by lamplight and pretending he didn't mind, and that image, that specific image of him hunched over his notebook, lamplight making his face look too old, was the thing that had gotten her out of bed at 5 this morning and into a second-hand blouse she'd ironed the night before and across town to this, the Vescari wedding. Every agency catering company in Blackridge had been tipped double rate for this job, and Rowan knew why. Everybody knew why. You didn't say the name Vescari out loud in certain parts of the city without checking over your shoulder first. You didn't touch the glassware wrong or let your expression slip when you heard the conversations happening above your head. You kept your eyes down, your pace steady, and you thanked whatever luck you had that men like these needed someone to carry their champagne. She smoothed her collar, straightened the name badge, and pushed through the service door. The kitchen was chaos, 12 servers moving in tight orbits around each other, the head caterer shouting in 3 directions simultaneously, the smell of roasted garlic and something expensive and probably wasted hanging thick in the hot air. A woman named Dolores, who had run Blackridge Prestige Catering for 20 years and had a voice like gravel in a tin can, grabbed Rowan's arm the moment she crossed the threshold. "You're late." "Bus broke down." "I don't care." "I know." Dolores looked at her for a half-second longer than necessary. Not with sympathy, exactly, but with the particular calculation of someone who needed warm bodies and was going to use what she had. Main floor, silver tray service. Champagne rounds until dinner, then you switch to water. You stay invisible. You speak when spoken to, and you don't make eye contact with the family table. She leaned in. "Especially not the groom." Rowan nodded. She'd been briefed at the agency. Lucien Vescari, 34, head of the Vescari Empire since his father's death 4 years ago. Described by people who knew him as methodical, by people who feared him as something else entirely. She took the silver tray from the rack and loaded it with 5 flutes of champagne, the glasses catching the light like something fragile pretending to be beautiful. Then she pushed through the swinging door and stepped into the ballroom. The noise hit her first. An orchestra playing something low and sweeping, crystal and cutlery chiming beneath the conversation of 200 people packed into a room that had been built to make power feel comfortable. The ceiling was glass and marble, rain streaking down the skylights in gray ribbons, and the chandeliers overhead were burning warm gold against all that wet darkness outside. Rowan moved through the room with the practiced invisibility of someone who had spent most of her adult life being the least important person present. She kept the tray level, her pace even, her face arranged into the neutral expression that said, "I am furniture," and she had long ago made her peace with that. She made the first round without incident. She was halfway through the second, edging along the outer ring of the room, past a cluster of men in dark suits who smelled like imported cigarettes, when the clasp on her necklace shifted and the pendant fell forward out of her collar. She didn't notice. She was focused on not sloshing the champagne. The man nearest to her, late 50s, broad-shouldered, a scar running white across his jaw, glanced down at her tray. Then his gaze moved upward, the way a person's eyes drift without real intent. He was looking at her neck, at the pendant resting against the front of her blouse. A phoenix. Black obsidian, silver setting, slightly tarnished at the edges, the kind of tarnish that came from decades and not from neglect. The bird's wings were spread wide, mid-ascent, the engraving detailed enough that you could see the individual feathers even from a short distance. The man stopped speaking mid-sentence. His glass halted halfway to his mouth. Rowan sensed the shift in the air before she understood what caused it. It was a physical thing, the way pressure changes before a storm gets worse. A sudden heaviness, a stillness in the noise around her. She turned slightly, instinctively checking behind her for a dropped tray or spilled drink, some small disaster she needed to contain. There was nothing behind her. The stillness was in front. The man with the scarred jaw was staring at her chest, not with anything she recognized as desire or threat, but with something rawer than either. Something that looked almost like shock, and beneath the shock, something that looked like fear. He said a name under his breath. She didn't catch it. He took a step back from her without taking his eyes off the pendant. The man beside him noticed. Then the man beside him. Conversation began dying in small patches, rippling outward from where she stood like something dropped in still water. Heads turned. The orchestra kept playing for another 30 seconds before the conductor lost the thread of his audience and the music tapered off into an awkward silence that filled the room like smoke. Rowan stood in the middle of it with 5 glasses of champagne on a silver tray and no idea what was happening. One of the bosses rose to his feet. He was old, 70 maybe, rail-thin and white-haired, with the kind of stillness that came from having given orders for so long that the body learned to conserve itself. He rose slowly, with effort, gripping the edge of the table. He was staring at the pendant with an expression that Rowan could only describe as devastated. Then the man beside him rose. Then another. One by one, in a motion that moved around the family table like a slow, solemn wave, 7 men in expensive suits stood up, not in welcome, not in ceremony, in something private and enormous that Rowan did not have a name for. The ballroom had gone completely silent. 200 people were looking at her. "What is that?" The man with the scarred jaw spoke quietly. He wasn't asking anyone in particular. His voice was low, but the room was so quiet it carried. "Where did you get that?" Rowan's mouth went dry. "Excuse me?" "The pendant." His eyes moved to hers for the first time. "Where did you get it?" She felt the heat rise in her face. Not embarrassment, something closer to animal instinct, the crawling awareness of being watched by too many things at once. Her grip on the tray tightened. "It was my mother's." The old man who had risen first made a sound, not a word. Something smaller than a word, something that came out of him involuntarily, the sound a person makes when something they had accepted as permanently lost suddenly appears in front of them. "Who is your mother?" he said. "She's gone." Rowan's voice came out steadier than she felt. "She left when I was 9. Across the room, at the far end of the family table, a man had not risen. He was sitting with the particular stillness of someone who had spent years learning how not to react to things, and he was watching Rowan with dark eyes that gave nothing away. He was the youngest person at that table by at least 15 years. His suit was black. His jaw was sharp and angled, his expression arranged into something that was almost composed. Almost. He was watching the pendant. Then he was watching her face. Lucien Vescari had not risen because Lucien Vescari never did anything the same way the other men did. But his fingers, curled loosely around the stem of his wineglass, had gone white at the knuckle. Dolores materialized out of nowhere, a hand closing around Rowan's upper arm from behind with bruising firmness, and she felt herself being steered backward toward the edge of the room. "I'm sorry, gentlemen. We're so sorry for the interruption." Dolores was already fabricating professionalism from thin air, her voice smooth and apologetic, and utterly hollow. "Let her go." The old man who had spoken, Rowan would later learn his name was Edrin Callow, who ran the eastern ports, said it quietly but absolutely. Dolores's hand released. "Come here," Callow said. Rowan did not move. Behind her, she could feel the room's attention like physical pressure on her spine. She thought absurdly about the electric bill. She thought about Eli's face in lamplight. She thought about the fact that if she walked toward that table, she was walking into something she didn't understand and could not predict. And she thought about the fact that if she didn't, she would probably lose this job and the $42 she needed was not going to appear from anywhere else by Monday. She walked toward the table. The tray was still in her hands. The champagne flutes hadn't spilled. She couldn't have explained why she was still holding it except that it gave her something to do with her hands, some small physical fact to anchor herself to while the room contracted around her. She stopped 3 feet from Edrin Callow and looked at him. He was looking at the pendant with an expression she couldn't fully decode. Recognition, grief, something old and unresolved stirring behind his eyes like sediment lifted off a riverbed after a long rain. "Where did she go?" he asked. "When she left?" "I don't know." It was the truth. She had been 9. She had come home from school one Tuesday afternoon and her mother was not there and had not come back. And the only thing she'd left was the pendant sitting on the kitchen table beside a glass of water that had gone cold. No note, no explanation. Just the bird with its wings spread wide in black stone, already tarnished, already carrying the weight of something Rowan hadn't understood then and still didn't. "You said she's gone," said the man with the scarred jaw. "Do you mean she's dead?" "I mean she left." Rowan met his eyes. "There's a difference." Something passed between the men at the table. A look, a current of shared knowledge, the shorthand of people who had spent years in rooms together. She couldn't read it. She was not supposed to be able to read it. From the far end of the table, Lucien Vescari set down his wine glass and stood. He was tall, taller than she'd registered from across the room, and he moved with the kind of economy that came from never wasting a step. He came around the table without hurrying, and the path between them cleared automatically, 200 people rearranging themselves at the molecular level to get out of his way. He stopped in front of her. He was close enough that she could see the specific shade of his eyes, dark brown, almost black in the light of the chandeliers, and the small, controlled way he was breathing. He looked at the pendant for a long moment. Then he looked at her face. "What's your name?" he said. "Rowan Vale." Something moved across his expression. Not shock. He had schooled his face too well for that. Something more deliberate. He was filing her name somewhere important. "Who hired you tonight?" "Blackridge Prestige Catering? And you took this job because—" "I needed the money." She said it flatly, without apology or embarrassment, because she had long since stopped being ashamed of the truth when the truth was simple. "I didn't know who the client was." He studied her face the way people study faces when they're looking for something specific. She had no idea what he found there. "Keep the pendant inside your blouse," he said. "Don't let anyone else see it tonight." "You're not going to tell me what this is about?" He held her gaze for a moment that felt longer than it was. "Not tonight." "Then I'm going back to work." She adjusted the tray. "Unless you're planning to fire me, which is your prerogative, but I'd appreciate the pay for the hours I've already worked." He almost smiled. It was a controlled thing, barely there, like watching a crack appear in marble, the kind of expression that happened in spite of itself. "Go back to work," he said. "Stay visible to my staff. Don't leave the building alone." She opened her mouth to ask why, but he had already turned back to the table, and the room had already begun to breathe again, the orchestra resuming with hesitant strings, the noise of 200 people restarting like an engine turned over after a stall. And Rowan stood in the middle of it with her tray of champagne and her second-hand heels and the pendant burning against her chest like something radioactive, and tried to figure out what had just happened. She made 3 more rounds. She kept her eyes down. She did her job. It was 40 minutes later, in the service corridor behind the kitchen, that she heard the voices. She had gone to refill her tray and taken a wrong turn. The Vescari estate was a labyrinth of marble hallways, and she'd ended up in a corridor she didn't recognize, narrow and unlit, except for the light bleeding under a closed door at the far end. She would have backtracked immediately, except that she heard her own name. Not her full name, just the girl. But the context was unmistakable. She pressed her back against the wall and stopped breathing. She has no idea. A voice she didn't recognize, so male, middle-aged, clipped. That's clear. Whether she knows doesn't matter. A second voice. Older. Drier. The pendant's been seen. Half the room saw it. Which means Callow's people are already talking. Which means the problem is the same problem it's always been, just wearing a different face. The older voice paused. The daughter can't be allowed to start asking questions. A silence. How contained does it need to be? Another silence, longer this time. Completely. Rowan's chest went cold. She moved. She didn't think about it. Her body made the decision before her mind caught up, turning her back the way she'd come, moving fast and quiet on the narrow corridor floor, the champagne flutes abandoned on a window ledge because she didn't have the steadiness to carry them anymore. She made it back to the kitchen. She set her tray on the nearest rack. Dolores shot her a look from across the room, but didn't approach. Rowan pressed her palm flat against the steel counter and felt the cold travel up her arm. Completely. She had been working 3 jobs for 2 years. She had a brother doing homework by lamplight and a shut-off notice on her kitchen counter. She had spent 9 years trying not to think too hard about why her mother had left and what the pendant meant, and whether the silence in her childhood home was normal or something darker wearing normal as a disguise. And in the course of one dinner service, she had become something that 2 men in a darkened corridor were discussing in the language of problems that needed to be made to disappear. She reached up and pressed the pendant against her chest through the fabric of her blouse, and felt the engraved edges of the phoenix pressing back against her palm, and thought about her mother's face, the memory worn thin from years of use, the specific angle of her jaw, and the way she used to say Rowan's name like it meant something more than just a name, and something hardened in her chest. Not courage. Courage was something you chose. This was different. This was a thing that forms when you run out of alternatives, and what's left is the shape of a decision made by elimination. She couldn't go back to work as though she hadn't heard. She couldn't leave. Lucien Vescari had told her not to leave the building alone, and she had been too annoyed to ask why, and now she understood why. She reached into her apron pocket and found her phone. No signal. The estate's walls were thick. She exhaled slowly, watching her own breath fog slightly in the kitchen's air-conditioned air, and thought about the next 5 minutes. Just 5 minutes. Not the electric bill, not Eli, not the thing those men had meant when they said completely, just the next 5 minutes, and what she needed to do inside them. She needed to find Lucien Vescari. She didn't know if that was safe. She didn't know if he was part of whatever she'd overheard or separate from it. She didn't know anything except that he was the one person in this building who had looked at the pendant and looked at her face and said something other than a threat. And right now that made him the only option she had. She pushed off the counter and moved toward the door. She made it 8 feet down the hallway before the lights went out. Not the kitchen, the whole corridor, the whole wing. The emergency strips along the floor blinked on, red and low, turning the marble hallway into something underwater and wrong. And in that shifted light, Rowan heard the kitchen door bang open behind her and footsteps. Fast, deliberate, not running but moving with purpose, coming from the direction of the back entrance, coming toward her. She ran. She ran without knowing where she was going, which was the worst kind of running. The kind that used energy without buying distance. The kind where your body was moving faster than your mind, and your mind was 3 seconds behind trying to catch up. The emergency strips along the floor threw everything into red-edge shadow. The corridor bent left, then right, the marble walls turning identical in the low light, and Rowan pressed one hand against the surface as she moved to keep her orientation, the stone cold and slightly damp against her palm. Behind her, the footsteps had multiplied. She couldn't tell how many, 2, maybe 3, the sound bouncing off the walls in a way that made direction unreliable. She hit a stairwell and went up because up was the only door that wasn't already open, wasn't already something she'd have to fight through, and she took the stairs 2 at a time in heels that were going to leave marks on her feet. She'd feel for a week. First landing, second, she shoved through the door at the top and came out into a hallway she'd never seen, wider than the service corridors below, carpeted with actual wall sconces burning low amber light, the kind of hallway that belonged to the part of the building guests weren't supposed to be in. She stopped, pressed her back against the wall, listened. The stairwell door below opened, paused, and then nothing. Silence. Which was almost worse than pursuit, because it meant whoever it was had stopped, which meant they were thinking, which meant they knew the building better than she did and were deciding which direction she'd gone. She counted to 5 and moved. The hallway curved ahead, and she followed it without a plan, which was the honest truth of her situation right now. She was a woman in a second-hand blouse with $42 worth of electric bill debt running through the private wing of a crime lord's estate in the dark, and she did not have a plan. What she had was the pendant against her chest and the voice of a man she'd never seen saying the word completely, and those two things were driving her feet forward even as her brain kept throwing up the same useless observation, "You should not be here." She turned the corner and walked directly into Lucien Viscari. She hit his chest shoulder first, and he caught her by both arms before she could bounce backward, his grip firm and immediate, the reflexes of someone who had spent years in rooms where you needed to catch things before they fell. "Let go. Stop." His voice was quiet. Not gentle, quiet, which was different. The kind of quiet that expected to be obeyed. She stopped. He was looking past her, down the hallway she'd come from, his jaw tight, his breathing controlled. He had his phone in one hand, and in the low light she could see that whatever expression he'd been managing downstairs in the ballroom had slipped. Not far, but enough. His eyes were sharp and working, and she could feel, through the grip on her arms, that he was making calculations. "There were people following me," she said. "I know." He released her. "Walk with me. Don't make noise." "Who were they?" "Not now." "Yes, now." She didn't move. "I heard men talking in a corridor. They said my name. They said I needed to be dealt with completely. I'm not walking anywhere until you tell me who those men were and what that means." He looked at her. A long look, the kind that was actually an assessment, measuring something. Then he looked back down the corridor. "2 of Harwick's men," he said. "Harwick runs the northern contracts. He was at the dinner table." "The man with the scarred jaw." "No, the one who didn't speak." He started moving, and she followed because the alternative was standing alone in a dark hallway, and she'd already established that wasn't safe. "Harwick's been nervous since the moment you walked into the room. Nervous men do things that create more problems." "He wants to kill me." She said it plainly, the way she said hard things, getting the words out in the open so she could see their shape. "He wants to eliminate a complication." Lucien turned right, pulled a door open that looked like part of the paneling, and she realized it was a concealed entrance. He gestured her through. In his vocabulary, those are the same thing. The room beyond was a study. Leather chairs, a desk the size of a small boat, bookshelves floor to ceiling, and on the shelves not decoration but actual books, the kind that had been read. A single lamp burning on the desk. Lucien closed the panel behind them, and she heard a mechanism engage, a lock she couldn't see. "Sit down," he said. "I'd rather stand." "Suit yourself." He moved to the desk and set his phone down and looked at it for a moment, reading something or deciding something. And then he turned to face her with his arms crossed and his expression back in the composed register, but wearing it differently now, like a jacket put on in a hurry. "Tell me about your mother," he said. "Tell me why that pendant made 7 men stand up in a ballroom." A beat of silence. He wasn't used to being answered with a counter-demand. She could see him adjusting to it. "Both," he said. "At the same time. You first." She almost laughed. It came out as something shorter, a breath, sharp and humorless. She reached up and unclasped the pendant, held it in her palm, the obsidian black and flat in the lamplight. Her name was Seraphine Vale. She was there one morning and gone the next. I was 9. She paused. She left this on the kitchen table. No note, nothing, just this. He was watching the pendant in her hand the way people watch things that are simultaneously ordinary and devastating. I don't know what she did for work. I was 9. I didn't ask. She traveled sometimes. She always came back. A pause. Until she didn't. Who raised you after? A series of people who were paid to, and then myself. She closed her fingers around the pendant. Your turn. He was quiet for long enough that she thought he might refuse. Then he moved to one of the leather chairs and sat. Not with relaxation, but with the deliberate act of someone choosing to make themselves level with another person. 15 years ago, he said, there was a war. Not the kind that makes the news, the kind that happens in warehouses and parking structures and shipping containers. 3 syndicates fighting for the same port access. It ran for almost 2 years. He looked at his hands for a moment. I was 19. My father was still alive. He was in the middle of it. She waited. During the worst of it, there were ambushes. Coordinated ones, too precise to be random. Men were being killed before they even knew they were targets. The information was coming from inside. Or that's what everyone believed. 3 men at that table tonight almost didn't survive that period. He paused. And then one night, a woman appeared. Nobody knew where she came from. She got to 3 separate locations before the attacks happened and pulled people out. She didn't explain herself. She didn't ask for anything. She was just there. Rowan's chest was doing something she didn't have a name for, a slow, terrible tightening. She wore that pendant, Lucian said. Everyone who saw her described it the same way. A phoenix on black stone. They called her the Guardian. And then the war ended and she was gone and no one ever found out who she was. He looked up. Until tonight. The silence in the room was thick and particular, the kind that forms when 2 people are both processing the same enormous thing from different angles. You think she was my mother? Rowan said. I think the pendant is the same pendant. I think the timeline fits. I think 9 years old was when she stopped, and something she uncovered was why she had to stop. He held her gaze. I think you walked into this building tonight carrying a secret she spent the rest of her life making sure stayed buried. She's not dead, Rowan said. You don't know that. I don't know that she's dead either. She put the pendant back on. And I'm not going to decide she's dead because it's convenient for your theory. His jaw moved. He wasn't used to being spoken to this way. She could tell, not from arrogance, but from something more basic, the slight recalibration his whole posture went through each time she pushed back. He was around people who agreed with him. She was not one of those people and had not agreed with him once, and he was, against what seemed like his better judgment, paying attention to her. The door panel opened. A man came in, mid-30s, built wide across the shoulders, with a flat expression and a military cut to his hair. He crossed directly to Lucien and bent to say something low and fast. Lucien's face didn't change, but his eyes did. Something landed behind them and settled heavy. How many? Lucien said. 3 confirmed. 2 more on the perimeter. The man's eyes moved to Rowan briefly, measuring. Harwick didn't come alone tonight. He staged it. He planned this before the ceremony. Looks like. The man's voice was completely without affect, the tone of someone reporting weather. He knew there was going to be a disruption. He didn't know what kind. Lucien said nothing for a moment. His eyes moved to Rowan. You said you came here for the money, he said. Did anyone know you were going to be here tonight? Anyone at all? I found out I had the job Wednesday, she said slowly. I told my brother, no one else. How old is your brother? 14. Where is he now? She felt it before she understood it. The cold that had nothing to do with temperature spreading from the center of her chest outward. She reached into her apron pocket for her phone. Still no signal. She looked up. Lucien was already looking at the man with the military cut. Kellner, safe line, now. The man, Kellner, produced a phone and held it out to her. She dialed Eli's number from memory, her fingers hitting the buttons without shaking because she was not going to let them shake. Not yet. 1 ring, 2, 3. Hello? The voice wasn't Eli. It was a man's voice, adult, smooth, carrying a particular quality of performed calm. You must be Rowan. She stopped breathing. Your brother is fine, the voice continued. He's going to stay that way. That part is entirely up to you. The room felt very distant. The lamplight, the bookshelves, Lucien 2 feet away watching her face. She heard all of it, and none of it. I want to speak to him, she said. A pause. Then, Ro? Eli's voice, 14 years old, trying not to sound scared and failing. Ro, I don't know what's... The first voice came back. You understand the situation. Tell me what you want, she said. The pendant and your silence. Another pause, lighter, almost conversational. The pendant is an heirloom. We understand that. We're not unreasonable people. Give it to whoever comes to collect it. Walk away from whatever's been said to you tonight, and your brother goes home. No harm. Clean. A breath. You have until midnight. The line went dead. She stood holding the phone and felt the room come back in pieces. The carpet under her feet, the weight of the pendant against her sternum, the sound of Lucian saying her name once, not gently, the way you say someone's name when you need them present. She turned and held the phone out to Kellner and looked at Lucian. They have Eli, she said. Lucian stood. How long? Midnight. She checked the clock on the wall. 11:07. 53 minutes. She felt the calculation moving through her like something mechanical. They want the pendant. They said if I give it up and stay quiet, they let him go. You're not giving it to them, Lucian said. My brother, if you give it to them, they don't have a reason to let either of you go. His voice was flat and certain. You understand that? She understood it. That was the worst part. She understood it immediately. The logic was simple enough, but understanding something and accepting it were not the same thing, and right now there was a 14-year-old boy somewhere in the city who had been doing homework by lamplight 3 hours ago. Can you get him? She said. Lucian looked at Kellner. We'd need a location, Kellner said. The call was what, 40 seconds? Not enough to trace. Your apartment, Lucian said. Is that where he'd be? He doesn't go out at night. She gave the address, a 6th-floor walk-up on Meridian South, and she heard the hollowness of it as she said it, the way an address sounds like just a number and a street name when it's under threat. Kellner was already on the phone, moving toward the panel, speaking low. Rowan pressed her fingers against the edge of the desk and thought about Eli's voice, the way it had broken on her name. He was scared. He was trying not to be scared, which was worse. Who's behind this? She said. That's what we're going to find out. Lucian was at the desk now, pulling something from a locked drawer. No, tell me what you know. She moved around the desk, closer, close enough that he'd have to actively choose to look away from her if he wanted to. You've known all night that there was something connected to my mother. You told me to keep the pendant hidden. You told me not to leave alone. You knew there was danger before Harwick's men even moved. So, tell me what you know. He looked at her for a moment with that measuring look. There's a file, he said. It doesn't exist officially. No records, no copies anyone's admitted to. But the story's been circulating in certain circles for years. A woman who was inside the financial structure of the syndicate coalition, who was documenting everything, every corrupt payment, every political connection, every law enforcement officer who was on the payroll. He paused. She was building a case, the kind that doesn't just bring down criminals, the kind that takes out judges, politicians, people who've been untouchable. Rowan's blood was very cold and very slow. The story goes that she disappeared before she could use it, Lucian said, but she never destroyed it. She hid it instead. And you think my mother was that woman? I think whoever's been protecting that secret for 15 years just found out that Seraphine Vale had a daughter who's been walking around the city for 26 years with the pendant that proves she existed. His voice was measured and precise, a man laying out a situation without softening its edges. I think your phone call just confirmed that there are people inside this room tonight who've been maintaining that secret and who now see you as the loose end that ends it. A knock at the panel. Kellner came back in, and his expression said something was wrong before he spoke. He's not at the apartment, he said. Building's clear. Neighbor says she saw a black car parked out front around 9. She didn't see the boy leave. They moved him before the call, Lucian said, or he was never there. Kellner looked at Rowan. Is there anywhere else he'd go? Anyone he trusts? She thought. Eli was 14 and careful. She had raised him to be careful, which at the time had seemed like a practical virtue, and now felt like something she'd done to protect him from ordinary trouble. And ordinary trouble was no longer what this was. He had a friend, Marco, 3 streets over. He had a teacher he liked. He would not go willingly. No, she said. If he's not home, they took him. The silence that followed was not empty but loaded. every second of it sitting on her chest like something with weight. "I'm not giving them the pendant," she said. Kellner looked at Lucien. Lucien was watching her. "No," she said again, and her voice came out steady in a way she was holding together by pure mechanical function. "If I give it to them, it changes nothing for Eli. I know that. I understood it the moment you said it." She breathed. "But I need my brother back, and the only leverage I have is the one thing they want. So tell me what the pendant means, well, actually means, because the story about my mother is 15 years old, and you've been piecing it together out of rumors, and I need to know if there's something else, something they're more afraid of than the pendant." Lucien looked at her for a long moment. Then he opened the desk drawer and placed a photograph in front of her, black and white. A woman in her early 30s, standing in the shadow of what looked like a shipping container, her face 3/4 turned toward the camera. She was caught mid-motion, the way candid photographs catch people. Not posing, not aware of being seen. Rowan knew the angle of that jaw. She had been trying to hold on to the memory of it for 17 years. "Where did you get this?" Her voice came out as something she barely recognized. "It was my father's," Lucien said. "He kept it." She picked up the photograph and held it carefully, the way you hold things you're afraid of damaging and more afraid of losing, and looked at her mother's face for the first time in 17 years. Seraphine Vale was not dead. Rowan did not know that yet, not for certain, but looking at the photograph, the set of the shoulders, the specific quality of alertness, and even a half-turned face, she felt something she could not have named and did not try to. The knowledge, below the level of logic, below the level of anything that could be argued with, that the woman in this photograph had not chosen to disappear because she wanted to. She had disappeared because she was trying to keep something safe. And Rowan's hand went to the pendant, and she felt the edges of the phoenix under her fingers, and she thought, "What did you hide, Mama?" The lights in the study flickered. Then, from somewhere below them in the building, 3 rapid sounds that could only be one thing. Gunshots, then screaming, then the particular silence that follows when 200 people stop making noise all at once because something has happened that none of them have a language for. Kellner had his weapon out before the echo died. Lucien was already at the panel. He turned back to Rowan, and his eyes were doing the sharp, working thing, and behind them she could see the decision forming, whether to bring her, whether to leave her, what the cost of either choice was. "Stay here," he said. "Don't open that panel for anyone. Not anyone." "Lucien." 50 minutes, he said. "We find your brother." He went through the panel, and it sealed behind him. And Rowan stood alone in the lamplight with her mother's photograph in one hand, and the pendant burning against her chest, and the sound of chaos building below her in the building like water rising, and understood with a clarity she hadn't had an hour ago that the life she'd been living, the electric bills, the 3 jobs, the careful invisible existence she'd built for herself and Eli, was already gone. Whatever this was, she was already inside it. The only question left was how deep. The gunshots had come from the east wing. Rowan knew this because the second and third shots had been slightly louder than the first, which meant whatever was happening was moving toward the ballroom, toward the 200 guests who were now, if the silence below is any indicator, doing the specific frozen nothing that people do when their bodies understand danger before their minds catch up. She stood in the study and counted to 30. Lucien had said, "Don't open the panel." He had said it with the particular certainty of someone who had given orders in bad situations before and knew what happened when they weren't followed. She opened the panel. The hallway beyond was empty in the amber sconce light. No sound except the distant register of voices. Many voices. The low, chaotic undertow of a crowd that hasn't decided yet whether to panic. She moved fast and low, following the curve of the hall the way she'd come, her heels off now because she'd pulled them off without deciding to. The carpet cold under her feet, the photograph still folded in her apron pocket against her hip. She found the stairwell and went down. The ballroom doors were open. She came in through the side entrance, the service arch near the orchestra's left flank, and what she saw stopped her at the threshold. Nobody was shot. The crowd was intact, pressed back against the far wall in the particular compression of people trying to be behind other people. The orchestra standing with their instruments held awkwardly at their sides. The gunshots had come from outside. Through the glass ceiling, she could see the muzzle flash residue against the rain, the way smoke hangs in wet air. And what had followed was not an attack on the room, but a warning, or a demonstration, fired into the sky above the estate's north courtyard. A demonstration for whose benefit she was still working out. Edrin Callow was standing at the center of the family table with his hands flat on the surface and his face arranged into something beyond anger. Beyond anger was where you went when anger stopped being useful. He was speaking. She couldn't hear the words from across the room, but she could read the register, low and absolute, the cadence of a man delivering a verdict. Across from him, where Harwick had been seated, the chair was empty. Harwick was gone. Rowan scanned the room. Kellner was at the east doors speaking into a radio or a phone, his posture tight. 3 men she didn't recognize had positioned themselves near the main entrance with the specific stillness of men who had been placed there, not wandered. Lucienne was nowhere she could see. She moved along the wall, keeping inside the shadow of the drapery toward Callow's end of the table. She needed information. She needed it faster than the situation was providing it. She had 41 minutes. A hand closed on her shoulder from behind, and she spun, already pulling back, and found herself looking at a woman she hadn't noticed in the room before. 50 or so, silver hair cut short, wearing a dress that was expensive in the way that made you forget what it cost. Sharp eyes, a face that had made a lot of decisions and lived with them. "You're Seraphine's daughter," the woman said. Not a question. Her voice was low and carried a particular quality. Not unkind, but stripped of everything that wasn't essential. "Who are you?" "My name is Vera Callow." She didn't release Rowan's shoulder, but the grip changed, became something closer to steadying than restraining. "Edrin is my husband, and I knew your mother." The room continued its slow reformation around them, people beginning to move again in the jerky, uncertain way of crowds recalibrating, but Rowan felt the words land in the specific silence that existed inside of all of that. "You knew her," Rowan said. "I know her." Present tense, deliberate. Vera Callow's eyes held hers without apology. "She's alive, Rowan." The floor didn't move. The chandelier didn't swing. Everything stayed exactly where it was, and still the world tilted slightly on whatever axis it was using tonight. "Where?" Rowan said. "That's the part that's complicated." Vera steered her, gently but with clear intent, toward the edge of the room, away from the crowd's center of gravity. "What I can tell you is that she went underground 15 years ago because the people she'd documented were going to kill you and your brother to get to her. She made a choice." "She made a choice?" Rowan heard the flatness in her own voice. "She chose to let us think she was gone. She chose to let you live." Vera said it without gentleness, the way a doctor states a diagnosis. "That's not the same thing." Rowan said nothing. There was too much happening in her chest to convert into language quickly enough to be useful. "She left the pendant for a reason," Vera said. "She knew that if anything ever surfaced, if the people who'd been protecting the secret started moving, the pendant would identify you to the people who'd protect you. The people who owed her." She paused. "She planned for tonight. Not this specific night, but this type of night. She planned for her daughter to walk into a mafia wedding and get shot at. She planned for her daughter to have allies when the time came." Vera stopped, turned to face her directly. "The archive exists. The files she compiled. They're real, and they're intact, and they're coded in a system only you can access. I've never heard of any archive." "You don't need to have heard of it." Vera's voice dropped lower. "You need to have your mother's DNA, and you do." Something moved across the back of Rowan's neck, a physical sensation she associated with the moment before bad news. "What does that mean?" "It means the archive is biometrically locked. Seraphine designed it that way. The only key is biological. Her line. You or your brother." Vera glanced toward the door, a quick assessment. "It also means that the people who want it buried have known, for 15 years, that as long as her children were alive, the archive could be opened." The implication arrived whole and fully formed, the way the worst things did. "They've always known about us," Rowan said. "They've always known about you." Vera met her eyes. What changed tonight is that you walked into this room wearing the pendant, which tells the people who owe your mother that it's time, and it tells the people who fear her that they're running out of time. She paused. Harwick is one of those people. He's been the primary protector of that secret for 15 years. He has been, specifically, the man responsible for monitoring you and your brother. Rowan's breath came in short and uneven. She controlled it. He's been watching us for years, and Eli is a pressure point they've used before. Vera's expression shifted, a small tightening around the eyes that was the closest thing to compassion she'd shown. In 2019, there was an incident, a car accident near your brother's school. You probably thought it was random. 2019. Eli had been 11. He'd been hit by a car pulling out of the school lot. The driver had fled. He'd fractured his wrist and spent 6 hours in the emergency room, and Rowan had sat in a plastic chair in the waiting area, feeling the specific terror of someone who has so few people left that losing one of them is not a subtraction but an annihilation. She had thought it was random. That was a message, Vera said quietly, to your mother, wherever she is, that they could reach you. The chandelier light above them was very bright and very warm and completely indifferent to all of this. Rowan pressed the back of her hand against her mouth for a moment and breathed through her nose, slow and deliberate, until the tightening in her throat loosened enough to speak. What does Lucian know? She said. More than he's told you. Less than he thinks. Vera's eyes moved past her again. Find him. The people who took your brother are not going to honor a midnight deadline. That call was designed to make you compliant while they put pieces in place. You have less time than they said. Rowan was already moving before Vera finished the sentence. She found Lucien in the corridor outside the estate's security room, which was a room she'd had no idea existed until she followed Kellner's trail backward through 2 hallways and a fire door, and found them both standing over a bank of monitors showing the estate's perimeter in gray infrared. Lucien had his jacket off and his sleeves rolled up, and he was looking at the screens with the concentrated stillness of someone who had been doing this, running bad situations in real time, for long enough that the adrenaline had burned off, and what was left was just function. He looked up when she came in. You opened the panel, he said. Yes. She moved to the monitors. What are these showing? North and east perimeters are clear. Southgate had movement 20 minutes ago. Vehicle, no plates, stopped for 40 seconds and left. He pointed to a screen showing a stretch of service road. Harwick's people. They're not here for a fight, Rowan said. They're already repositioning. Vera Callow told me the midnight deadline was false. They're moving faster. His jaw tightened. You talked to Vera. She knew my mother. She watched his face. You knew that. A pause. I suspected. That's not the same as telling me. She kept her voice even with effort. She said you know more than you've shared. I know pieces. He turned from the monitors. I didn't know how much was true and how much was... Tell me the pieces. He looked at her for a moment, and she could see him deciding, the actual visible process of a man weighing what he owed against what he'd been protecting, and she didn't have the patience for the calculation. Lucien. She said his name the way you say something when you need it to land. My brother is out there. Tell me the pieces. He exhaled. 3 months ago, I received a communication. Anonymous, routed through 4 different servers. It said that the archive existed, that it was going to surface, and that when it did, certain people at the Vescari organization's periphery were going to be named in it. He paused. Not me. Not my father's core operations, but associates. People we've worked with. So you had a stake in it. I had an interest in knowing what was coming. His voice was flat without being defensive. I've spent 3 months trying to identify who sent it. I haven't been able to. But you knew to watch for a trigger, something that would signal the archive was activating. Yes. And then I walked in with the pendant. Yes. She absorbed this. The study, the conversation, the photograph, all of it had been more calculated than it had felt in the moment. He had been managing her, not lying to her exactly, but shaping the information the way people shape rivers, not stopping the flow, just directing it. She had known this, distantly, and had chosen to keep moving anyway because the alternative was paralysis, and paralysis got Eli killed. But knowing it and having it confirmed were different textures of the same bad feeling. "Is there anything else?" she said. "Anything you know that you haven't said?" He held her gaze. The anonymous communication included a name, the person behind the conspiracy, the one who ordered Seraphine buried, who's been running the protection operation for 15 years. He stopped. "Say it." Martin Ashcroft. The name meant nothing to her for 2 seconds. Then it meant everything. Martin Ashcroft was not a criminal name. He was a political name, a consultant, a strategist, the kind of man whose photograph appeared in newspapers standing slightly behind the people who won elections. He had been a fixture in Blackridge's political landscape for 20 years. He was on charity boards. He gave speeches at universities. 3 of the city's last 4 mayors had been his clients. "Ashcroft," she said. "He's here tonight." Lucian's voice was completely level. "He was in the ballroom. He arrived with the Callow delegation as a guest." She stared at him. "He's in this building." "He was." Kellner's voice came from the doorway. He'd appeared without her noticing, and she was going to have to start noticing. "He left during the commotion after the shots. His car exited the north gate 12 minutes ago." "With Harwick?" Rowan said. Kellner looked at Lucian. Something passed between them. "Kellner," she said. "With Harwick?" "No." Kellner's voice was careful in a way that told her she wasn't going to like what came next. "With Vera Callow." The room went very quiet. Rowan turned the information over once, carefully, the way you handle something that might be a mistake but probably isn't. Vera Callow, who had known her mother, who had pulled her aside in the ballroom and loaded her with exactly enough truth to seem trustworthy, who had told her to find Lucienne, to hurry, that the deadline was false, who had left the building with Martin Ashcroft. "She was directing me," Rowan said. "She was buying time," Lucian said, "keeping you in the building while Ashcroft moved. She told me about the archive. She confirmed it exists." His voice was measured. "Which means they know you didn't know about it. Which means they're not afraid of what you know. They're afraid of what you can access." The biometric lock. Vera had told her that, had given her that information deliberately, had explained exactly what made her and Eli valuable, and therefore exactly what made them a liability that needed to be contained before they could be used. "She gave you the map," Lucian said quietly, "and while you were reading it, Ashcroft moved the pieces." Rowan pressed her fingers against the security console, felt the hard edge of it against her palm, and used the physical sensation to stay inside the moment rather than the implications that were stacking up around it like walls closing. Vera had been warm. Vera had said her mother was alive and used the present tense and looked at Rowan with eyes that seemed to understand the specific weight of 17 years. And all of it had been engineered. "My mother," Rowan said. "Is she actually alive?" Lucienne was quiet for a beat too long. "I don't know," he said. "The communication I received didn't address it." Vera said she was. Vera said what was most useful for her to say. She absorbed this too. Put it somewhere. The photograph was still in her apron pocket, and she was not going to think about that right now because thinking about it would cost her something she couldn't afford to spend. Her phone. She still had Kellner's phone from the earlier call. She pulled it from her pocket and looked at it. The number that had called from Eli's phone, she hadn't memorized it, but she'd seen enough of it to work with. "Can you trace the number that called me earlier?" she said to Kellner. "Disposable line, probably." "Probably. Can you try?" He took the phone, looked at the call log, moved to a laptop on the side table. His fingers were fast and certain. Rowan turned back to the monitors. South Gate, North Perimeter, East Road. She was looking at the city the way you look at a problem, trying to find the shape of it, the place where it was thinner than it looked. Eli would not go quietly. She had raised him to be careful, and she had also, without intending to, raised him to be difficult in the specific way of someone who had learned early that the world did not automatically arrange itself in your favor. He would be looking for an exit. He would be cataloging details. He was 14 and small for his age, and smart in ways that sometimes frightened her because smart was not always protection. "Got something," Kellner said. She was across the room before he finished the sentence. Disposable, like I said, but it pinged 3 towers before the call connected. The origin ping came from... He stopped, looked at the screen with a slight frown. The Meridian South waterfront, the old processing plant. She knew it. Everyone in the neighborhood knew it. A decommissioned fish processing facility at the end of the harbor road, abandoned for 11 years. The kind of building the city kept meaning to demolish and kept not getting around to. Dark. Isolated. Access from 2 roads, both of which had sight lines long enough to see trouble coming. The perfect place to put someone you wanted to keep and didn't want found. That's where Eli is, she said. We don't know. That's where he is. She turned to Lucienne. I need to go. Not alone. Then come. She was already moving toward the door. But I'm not waiting for a strategy meeting. Lucien picked up his jacket from the chair back where he'd left it. His expression was the composed professional thing again, but the eyes behind it were moving fast, working the angles, and she caught something else in them beneath the calculation. Something that wasn't quite concern and wasn't quite determination, but lived in the space between those 2 things. My car is in the east garage, he said. Kellner, take the north approach with 4 men. We go south. Nobody moves until we have visual confirmation. Kellner was already on his radio. They moved through the estate fast, through corridors she was starting to know the shape of, past the kitchen where Dolores had vanished into whatever protocol catering companies had for gunshots and evacuations, and out through the east service exit into the rain. The storm had settled into a steady, heavy fall, the kind that blurred everything past 20 feet, and the east garage was 50 yards across exposed courtyard. They ran. The car was black, low, and Lucien drove the way he did everything else, without wasted motion, with a particular economy that was either very disciplined or very cold, and she couldn't tell which because she was watching the city slide past the rain-streaked windows and thinking about the processing plant and the 2 roads with long sight lines. If they saw the car coming, they'd move Eli. Or worse. They'll see us, she said. I know. They'll move him. I know. So what's the plan? He didn't answer immediately, which meant he was working it out in real time, which meant the plan was not fully formed, which meant they were doing the same thing she'd been doing all night. Moving fast and trusting that the next thing would reveal itself before the current thing ran out. She reached up and gripped the dashboard and watched the harbor road unspool in the headlights. The processing plant appeared through the rain as a dark mass against a darker sky, its silhouette jagged and lightless, except for 1 window on the 2nd floor. A single warm rectangle in all that black, barely visible through the weather, the kind of light that said occupied in the same way a held breath said afraid. Lucien killed the headlights. They rolled to a stop 200 meters from the main gate, the engine dropping to idle, the rain so loud on the roof it filled the silence completely. Rowan's eyes stayed on that 2nd floor window. I count 1 light source, she said. 2nd floor, east face. Same. He was on the phone. Kellner, coordinating the north approach. He spoke in short, clipped bursts and listened and ended the call. Kellner's 4 minutes out. I can't wait 4 minutes. Rowan. She opened the door and was out before the sentence finished. The rain hit her all at once, immediate and cold, plastering her hair flat and soaking through her blouse in seconds. She ran low along the fence line, following the shadow of the perimeter wall, her feet finding the ground by feel in the dark. Behind her, she heard the car door open and then Lucien's footsteps, even and close, following without calling after her. The side gate was padlocked. Old padlock, the kind that rusted in sea air. She found a length of broken concrete block by feel, lifted it, brought it down on the lock twice. 3rd time, the shackle gave. She pushed through. The interior of the plant was vast and dark, and smelled of rust and salt water, and something else beneath those. Something chemical and faint, the ghost of industrial function. She moved toward the internal stairs by the light of Lucien's phone held low, his hand on her shoulder from behind, the 2 of them navigating in the way of people who had reached a level of necessity that eliminated the need for discussion. 1st step. 2nd. From above, a voice, muffled by walls and floor but audible. Adult male, giving an instruction. Then, her chest clenched. The specific quality of silence that followed an instruction being given to someone who didn't want to comply. She took the stairs fast. The second floor landing was a long, open space, former processing line, the equipment long since stripped, and at the far end a door stood open with warm light bleeding through it, and in the light, backlit and sharp, were two silhouettes, a large one standing and a smaller one seated. Eli. She had taken 2 steps toward the door when the floor beside her erupted in splinters from a shot she never heard coming, the suppressed crack of it registering a half-second late, and she threw herself sideways against the wall as Lucian moved in the opposite direction. And from the darkness to her left, a voice she recognized said, "Don't." She turned. Kellner stood in the shadow 15 feet away, not coming through the north approach with 4 men, not coordinating on a radio. Standing here, inside, ahead of them, with a weapon pointed at a point between her and Lucian, his expression carrying the particular flatness she had misread all night as professional detachment. She understood it now. "You told Ashcroft," she said. "When you called about Eli's apartment, you told him we were coming." Kellner said nothing. His silence had a different quality than before. Not calculating, not assessing, finished. The silence of someone who had already made every calculation and arrived. Lucien's voice came from the dark to her right, completely level, controlled, with something underneath it that was not controlled at all. "How long?" "Long enough." Kellner's gun didn't move. "Give me the pendant. Both of you on your knees. This ends clean." Clean. There was that word again. The same word the man on the phone had used. She had a sudden vivid image of whoever had trained these people, whoever had written their internal vocabulary, a man like Ashcroft, a man who turned violence into logistics and called the results. Nobody moved for 3 seconds. 3 seconds was long enough for Rowan to understand the geometry of the room. Kellner at her left, 10 o'clock, 15 feet, weapon up. Lucien at her right in the dark. She couldn't see him, but she could hear him breathing, controlled, slow, the breathing of someone conserving function. The door ahead with the light bleeding through it, and Eli's silhouette and 1 guard, large, standing. 3 seconds was long enough for her to understand that Kellner was not going to wait much longer. She threw the concrete block she'd been holding since the gate. Not at Kellner, at the single work light hanging from the ceiling rafter between them, a bare bulb on a hook. And it connected, and the bulb exploded, and the second floor went dark in the specific way of spaces that have no secondary light source, absolute and immediate. And in that darkness, she dropped flat to the floor as the shot that had been coming went over her head and hit the wall behind where she'd been standing. She heard Lucien move, fast and certain, the sound of someone who had trained for precisely this kind of darkness. And then she heard Kellner make a sound, not a cry, something more compressed, the involuntary noise of impact, and then the weapon skittered across the concrete floor, and she tracked it by sound and got her hand on it in the dark. Up. She was on her feet before the ringing in her ears from the shot had fully faded. "Eli!" She was already running toward the door. "Eli, get down!" She hit the door frame at full speed and went through into the light. The guard was not large from a distance. Up close, he was enormous, the kind of build that came from years and intention, and he had already turned from Eli toward the door, already had his hand moving toward his jacket, and she didn't stop. She came through the door low and drove her shoulder into his midsection the way she'd once driven a shopping cart into a shelf corner when she was 7 and had never forgotten the physics of it. Mass plus direction equaling a result that had nothing to do with size. He didn't go down, but he went back, 3 steps, 4, his hand losing the jacket and grabbing instead for her arm, and she twisted inside the grip and brought Kellner's weapon up and pressed it against the underside of his jaw. Everything stopped. His breathing was very loud. Her breathing was very loud. The rain hammering the roof of the processing plant was the loudest thing in the world. "Floor," she said. He went to the floor. "Row." Eli's voice behind her. She turned. He was duct-taped to a metal chair, hands behind him, ankles secured, but he was upright, and his eyes were open and tracking, and his face was doing the thing faces do when they've been scared for hours, and are trying not to show how scared they've been. A bruise was forming along his left jaw, purple-red against his brown skin. Someone had hit him. She crossed to him in 3 steps and went to her knees and started on the tape at his wrists, her hands working by feel, the weapon tucked against her hip. The tape was wound tight, and she didn't have anything to cut it with, and her nails were short from working with her hands, and she tore at the edge of it with her teeth until it gave. "I'm okay," he said. "I know." She wasn't looking at his face. She was focused on the tape. "I know you are. They didn't hurt me. They just... your jaw. That was when they put me in the car. I tried to run." He paused. "I almost made it." She got the second wrist free and moved to his ankles. "I know you almost made it." "How do you know?" "Because you're you." She peeled the last of the tape away and stood and took his arm and pulled him to his feet, and he was taller than she'd registered in the months since she'd last really looked at him. He'd grown, somehow, in the middle of all this. He'd just kept growing. And he swayed slightly and caught himself on her shoulder, and she held him for a second, her hand against the back of his neck, his heartbeat fast and present against her palm. "We need to move," she said. "Yeah." He pulled back, found his footing, looked at the man on the floor, looked at the weapon in her hand, looked at her face. "Okay." Lucien was in the doorway. He had a cut along his forearm, not deep but bleeding freely, his sleeve dark with it, and he was holding Kellner's radio. He looked at Eli with a brief, assessing look, the kind that cataloged damage and potential mobility, and then looked at Rowan. "Kellner's secured," he said. "We have a problem." "What problem?" "3 vehicles just came through the south gate." He held up the radio. "I've been listening. Ashcroft's here." She looked at him. "He didn't send people," Lucien said. "He came himself." She didn't ask why. She already understood why. A man who had spent 15 years controlling this from a distance had just watched his entire network start to come apart in the span of one evening, and men like Ashcroft, she was beginning to understand, were not the kind who delegated the final moments. The final moments were the only part that mattered to them. The final moments were where control was either confirmed or lost forever. "How many men?" she said. 8, maybe 10. They're setting a perimeter on the ground floor." She looked at Eli, looked at the room. One door, the way they'd come, and one window, east-facing rain-black glass. She didn't know the drop, and felt the walls of the situation compress around her with the specific mechanical inevitability of a thing that had been moving toward this point all night. "The archive," she said. "What do I need to access it?" Vera said biometric. "Blood sample, voice confirmation, both at a specific terminal. Seraphine built a physical interface, not cloud-based. It can't be accessed remotely." He watched her face. "Rowan, the terminal is in this building." She stared at him. "The communication I received 3 months ago included a location," he said. "I thought it was a misdirection. I drove past this building twice." He paused. "The processing plant was bought through 12 shell companies. The last owner in the chain is a name that doesn't exist, which is exactly how your mother operated." She hid it here. Rowan looked at the walls, the stripped industrial space, the bones of a building that had been something else for 11 years, and underneath the rust was something else entirely. "She hid it in a building that looks abandoned." "Sub-basement," Lucien said. "The original plant had cold storage below the processing floor. The access stairs were sealed when the building was decommissioned. Sealed, not removed." From below them, the sound of boots on concrete, organized, spreading out, the sound of a search beginning. Eli was looking between them. "What are we doing?" "We're going down," Rowan said. Lucien led. He knew the building's layout from whatever reconnaissance he'd done in the past 3 months, or he was reconstructing it from the blueprints in his head, and either way he moved without hesitation, back through the second-floor space where Kellner was zip-tied to a support column with his own cuffs, past the stairs they'd come up, to a section of wall near the north end where the paneling was newer than the surrounding material. He felt along the edge of it, found the seam, pressed. The panel moved inward on a hinge, and behind it was darkness and the smell of cold air and old salt. Stairs going down. "Eli goes first," Lucien said. "I'll take the rear." Eli went. Rowan followed. Lucien pulled the panel shut behind them, and she heard him engage some kind of interior lock, his hands finding it in the dark from memory or from instinct, and then they were all three moving down into the cold dark with only Lucian's phone for light. The sub-basement was not what she'd expected. She'd expected storage, crates, equipment, the archaeology of an industrial past. What she found instead was a room that had been cleared and cleaned and maintained. Not recently, but regularly, up to some point, and then stopped. A work table along one wall, a single chair, and on the table a terminal. A laptop connected by cable to a sealed external unit, the whole assembly housed in a weatherproof case. The case closed, but not locked. Someone had been here and then stopped being here. At some point, the maintenance had ended. Rowan sat in the chair. She opened the case. The screen came to life immediately. The battery still held charge, which meant the case had a power source she couldn't see, which meant this had been built to last. The display was simple: a voice prompt on the left, a biometric reader on the right, a status bar at the top that said dormant in amber letters. She pressed her thumb to the biometric reader. The system thought. Then, partial match. Lineage confirmed. Secondary verification required. Voice, Lucian said, reading over her shoulder. She leaned toward the microphone. My name is Rowan Vale. My mother is Seraphine Vale. She paused. I don't know what else to say. The system thought again. Then the amber changed to green. The status bar changed, and the archive opened. Not all of it. She didn't have time for all of it, and she was aware of that with the very specific awareness of someone listening to boots moving overhead, getting organized, beginning to work the floor plan. But what the screen showed her in the first 30 seconds was enough. Column after column of documentation, financial transfers, recorded conversations, surveillance photographs, signed affidavits from sources whose names she didn't recognize, but whose position she did, cross-referenced against a list of names that made the room feel smaller. Martin Ashcroft's name appeared 47 times in the first document alone. Beside him, 2 sitting judges. A deputy commissioner of police, a state senator, 3 names from the organized crime structures she'd been surrounded by all evening, names she'd heard at the table, names the city knew. Her mother had built a bomb, and she had been sitting on it for 15 years waiting for someone to light the fuse. How do I transmit this? Rowan said. There's a transmission protocol built in, Lucian said. He was leaning over the table, reading fast, and his face was doing something she hadn't seen on it before. Not shock, he was too controlled for shock, but a kind of gravity, the expression of a man seeing the actual size of a thing he'd thought he understood. Seraphine pre-addressed it. Media contacts, federal oversight bodies, 3 international press organizations. He paused. She built a dead man's switch into the protocol. Once transmission begins, it goes to all recipients simultaneously. It can't be recalled. What's the activation? He straightened, looked at her. A specific phrase, spoken by a verified lineage match. He paused. She left the phrase in the system. It's on the screen. Rowan looked at the screen. The phrase was 4 words. She already knew them. Not because she'd seen them here, not because anyone had told her. She knew them because they were the 4 words her mother had said to her every night before she put her to sleep, in a voice that had been the entire architecture of safety in Rowan's early life, a voice she'd spent 17 years trying to hold on to as the memory wore thin. Tell the truth, Bird. She stared at the screen. Above them, the search had found the first floor panel. She heard the sound of it being found, questioned, tested. 20 seconds, maybe 30, before they found the lock. Maybe less. Rowan, Lucian's voice low and absolutely even. She heard Eli behind her, standing very still, not saying anything, just present. 14 years old and trying to be useful by not adding to the weight of the moment. And she loved him for it with a ferocity that compressed everything else to its correct scale. She leaned toward the microphone. Tell the truth, Bird. The system accepted the phrase. The transmission protocol initialized and the progress bar began to move, and at the top of the screen a counter appeared. A list of recipients, each one going from pending to transmitting in sequence, one by one, unstoppable and irreversible. The panel lock above them gave. She heard it. The specific sound of forced entry, clean and decisive. And then boots on the sub-basement stairs, fast, and the door at the bottom came open in the room filled with light from tactical flashlights, and men behind them, and she turned in the chair and faced it with her hands visible and the weapon on the floor where she'd placed it, because what happened next was not going to be decided by a weapon. Martin Ashcroft came through the door last. He was exactly what the newspaper photographs had always shown. Medium height, silver-haired, the face of a man accustomed to rooms deciding things in his favor. He dressed like someone who had never needed to run. He moved like someone who had never been in a room he couldn't control. He stopped when he saw the screen. He saw the transmission counter, the progress bar. He read the recipient list fast, the way a man reads a thing he has feared for 15 years and is now finally seen materialize. His face did something complicated and brief, and then reassembled itself. "Stop it," he said. "Can't," Rowan said. "Once it starts, it can't be recalled." That's how she built it. "There's always a way to—" "There isn't." She held his gaze. She specifically designed it so there wasn't. She knew the people who'd be trying to stop it. He looked at the screen again, at the counter climbing, transmitting, one recipient after another, going out into the world with no mechanism for retrieval. Then he looked at her. "You don't understand what you've done," he said. "I understand exactly what I've done. The people named in those files, the structures that come apart when this gets out, you think this city functions without those structures? You think the order that exists just continues when you— I think my mother spent 15 years in hiding so that a man like you couldn't keep deciding what order looks like." She said it without heat, without rage. The rage had been there earlier and had burned off, leaving something cleaner and colder underneath. "I think a lot of people's families didn't get to have them because of what you decided to bury." His eyes moved to Lucian. "You understand what happens to the Viscari organization when—" "I understand," Lucian said. His voice was the flattest she'd heard it. He was standing 3 feet to her left, and he hadn't moved since Ashcroft came through the door, and his arms were at his sides, and he was looking at Ashcroft the way you look at a thing that is already past the point of negotiation. Ashcroft's men were still in the room. 6 of them, weapons up, and the arithmetic of the situation was not in Rowan's favor, and Lucien's favor, and Eli's favor, and she was aware of this the way you are aware of weather, not something you can argue with, something you navigate. "The transmission completes in 4 minutes, she said. "After that, you can do whatever you want to us. The information is already out. There's no version of the next 4 minutes where anything you do to me changes what's going to happen when those files arrive." She paused. "So you can spend those 4 minutes deciding whether adding 3 more names to the accounting makes any difference. Or you can leave." Ashcroft stood very still. His eyes went around the room. Lucian, Eli, Rowan, the screen, his own men, doing the same calculation she'd laid out for him, running it from his end, arriving at the same conclusion from a different direction. "You're 19% transmitted," one of his men said, reading the screen. "I know what it says," Ashcroft said quietly. The room held its breath. Ashcroft reached into his jacket. Lucian moved at the same time, not toward Ashcroft but sideways, putting himself between the hand coming out of the jacket and Rowan. And she was already pushing back from the chair, already getting her feet under her, already tracking the room for the geometry of what came next when Ashcroft's hand came out holding not a weapon, but a phone. He made a call. 1 word into it, to whoever answered. "Stand down." He ended the call. He looked at Rowan with the particular expression of a man who had spent 50 years learning to recognize when a room had turned against him, and who had survived that long by knowing which rooms were worth fighting and which ones were already over. 4 minutes, he said. 4 minutes, she agreed. He turned and walked toward the stairs. His men followed, in the silent, organized way of people trained to follow without explanation, and the room emptied of them in 30 seconds, and Rowan listened to the boots on the stairs and the sounds of them moving through the floor above, and then the larger silence of their exit. Eli exhaled. It was the longest exhale she'd ever heard from him, the exhale of 3 hours of compressed fear finally finding an exit. "Is it?" he started. "Not yet." She turned back to the screen. 31%. She sat back down in the chair. The cold storage room smelled of salt and old industrial grease and something else, something she couldn't place for a moment, and then placed. A specific soap. a specific clean linen smell she associated with being very small and being carried and being told that everything was going to be fine in a voice that was the entire world. The room had been maintained by someone who had been here regularly until they stopped. She pressed her fingers flat against the work table and looked at the grain of the wood and breathed. She was here, she said. Not to Lucien, not to Eli, to the room, to the 15 years of absence that had the shape of intention now instead of abandonment. Lucien said nothing. He was watching the transmission counter. Eli had moved to stand beside her, his shoulder against hers, warm and solid and present. 62%. 70. 81. A sound from above. Not Ashcroft's men. Different footsteps. Multiple. Moving fast. Rowan tensed. Lucien's hand moved toward the weapon he'd recovered somewhere in the last 10 minutes. The stairs. Coming down. Edrin Callow appeared at the bottom, breathing hard, his white hair disheveled, his face carrying something between fury and relief. Behind him, two of his own men. He looked at the screen. He looked at Rowan. "You did it," he said. "Almost," she said. 90%. He crossed the room and stood beside her and looked at the transmission counter with the expression of a man watching something he had been waiting a very long time to see. His hands, she noticed, were not entirely steady. 94-97. The counter climbed through the last few numbers in the particular silence of a room full of people who have stopped breathing. And then the status bar changed. The amber was gone. The green was gone. White letters, clean and absolute against a black screen. Transmission complete. The room exhaled. Rowan sat in the chair with her hands in her lap and felt the specific quality of a silence that follows irreversible things. And somewhere in the city, in offices, in newsrooms, on the screens of federal investigators and international journalists, her mother's 15 years of work was arriving, all at once, undeniable and complete. She reached up and pressed her fingers against the pendant. Eli's hand found her shoulder. From above them, through the concrete and the rust and the rain, Blackridge was about to change its shape. And from somewhere in the room, barely audible under the ambient noise of the storm, she almost missed it, would have missed it if she hadn't been sitting in the particular stillness of the aftermath. A sound came from behind the far wall. 3 slow knocks. Deliberate, patterned. The specific rhythm of something she knew from before she had language for it, from the years when the world was small and safe and built around a woman who used to knock 3 times on the doorframe of her room to signal that everything was okay. Rowan turned around and looked at the wall. 3 knocks. Rowan was on her feet before she'd made the decision to stand, crossing the room in 4 steps, her palm flat against the wall, feeling the surface. Concrete block, cold, solid, and behind it the specific pressure of a space that was not the same as the space on this side. "There's a room behind this," she said. Lucien was already moving along the wall, pressing, testing the seams. His hands found the edge of a panel on the left side. Different mortar, newer, the kind of repair that conceals rather than restores. And he worked the edge of it with his fingers until something gave, a concealed mechanism, simple and well-maintained. The panel swung inward. The space beyond was small. A room within a room, barely larger than a closet, lined with the same weatherproof casing material as the terminal. A cot against one wall, a water source, a lamp on a timer. The infrastructure of someone who had planned to wait. And a woman sitting on the cot with her hands in her lap and her eyes on the door. Rowan had been carrying the memory of her mother's face for 17 years, had polished it and worn it thin and patched the places where it had frayed with imagination, filling in the details that time had taken. She had been afraid, in some part of herself she'd never said out loud, that when she finally saw the actual face it would be unrecognizable, that the woman and the memory would be strangers. They were not strangers. Seraphine Vale was 51 years old and looked like someone who had spent 17 years in the company of difficult decisions. Her hair was shorter than the photograph and threaded with gray. The angles of her face were the same angles Rowan had spent her adult life catching in mirrors and recognizing with a complicated feeling she'd never had a clean name for. She was thin in the way of people who eat functionally rather than with pleasure. Her hands, Rowan noticed, were steady. She stood up from the cot. She looked at Rowan. Neither of them spoke for a moment that had the specific texture of things that had waited so long to happen that the happening itself needed a second to be believed. "You used the phrase," Seraphine said. Her voice was the voice from the memory, worn but intact, and hearing it in the actual air of an actual room after 17 years was the strangest thing Rowan had ever experienced. Not a relief exactly, not a joy exactly, something larger and more ambiguous than either. "I did," Rowan said. "The transmission completed?" "Yes." Seraphine closed her eyes for 2 seconds, then opened them. "Good. That's what you want to say." Rowan heard the edge in her own voice, measured and present. The edge of someone who had spent 17 years building something stable from the ruins of an early loss and was now standing in front of the cause of that ruin. After everything, good. Rowan, no. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Not yet. Tell me first. Tell me why. Seraphine was quiet for a moment, looking at her daughter's face with the particular expression of a person who has rehearsed a conversation 10,000 times and is finding, now that it's actually happening, that every version was inadequate. "I had documentation on 46 people," she said, "not peripheral players. The architecture, so the people whose removal would actually collapse the structure. When I understood what I had, I also understood what would happen to anyone near me." She paused. "They would have used you and Eli to get to me. They had already started watching the apartment." Another pause. "The car accident in 2019. You know about that now." "I know about it." "That was the third time." Seraphine's voice was even, too even, in the way of someone who had made their peace with something by sheer repetition of it. "There were 2 incidents before that, when Eli was younger, things that looked like accidents and weren't." Her jaw tightened briefly. "Every time I tried to move closer, they moved against you. So I stayed away. I stayed away and I maintained the system and I waited for an opening." 17 years, Rowan said. "Yes." "Eli grew up without a mother for 17 years. "Yes." "I raised him. I worked 3 jobs. She stopped, breathed. "I thought you were dead. I thought it was something I did. I was 9. And children decide things like that about themselves. That it was something they did." She looked at her mother's face and felt the words finding their shape after years in storage. Not clean and not dressed up, just accurate. "I needed you, and you weren't there, and there was no explanation, and I spent 17 years learning not to need you because needing you was a thing that led nowhere." Seraphine said nothing. "And you were here," Rowan said. "In a room in a building I've walked past." "I was. No defense in it, no qualification." "Say something else." "I can't make it smaller than it is," Seraphine said quietly. "I'm not going to try to. What I did, the choice I made it because the alternative was you and your brother in the ground. And I could not live in a world that contained that, but I understand completely that the world I gave you instead was not good. I know that." She looked at her daughter directly, without flinching from any of it. "I know that a mother who is absent and alive is not better than a mother who is present. I know that knowing I existed somewhere did not keep you warm or pay the electricity bill or sit with you when things were bad." Her voice remained steady through this. "I know all of it, and I have no defense, only a reason. A reason isn't the same as a right. No, it isn't." The room was very quiet except for the rain, still coming down above them, muffled through concrete and distance. Eli had come to stand in the panel doorway behind Rowan, and she heard him there without turning. The particular quality of his silence, the way he processed things by going still. He was 14 and he was listening, and he would have his own version of this conversation at some point, and she was not going to have it for him. "She's alive," Rowan said to him, without turning. "Yeah," Eli said. "I can see that." A beat. "Okay," he said. And then, after another beat, in a voice that was trying to be older than 14 and not quite making it, "Okay?" It was not forgiveness. It was not the absence of pain. It was something more practical and more merciful than either. The acknowledgement that a person could be 2 things at once, could be the source of damage and the thing you had been missing, and that the two facts could coexist without resolving. Rowan looked at her mother for another long moment, and then she turned to Lucien, who had been standing at the edge of the space with the particular quality of someone who understood they were witnessing something private and was holding himself at the correct distance. "We need to get out of this building," she said. "Yes," he said. They came up through the panel, through the sub-basement stairs, through the empty second floor where Kellner was still secured to the support column, and did not look at any of them as they passed. They came out through the side gate into the rain, all five of them. Rowan, Seraphine, Eli, Lucien, Edrin Kalau, who had waited at the bottom of the stairs with the silence of a man standing guard over something he owed, and the night air hit them, salt and cold and wet. And Blackridge was still there around them, the city going about its last few hours of not knowing what was coming. By dawn, it would know. The arrest began at 6 in the morning, before the city had fully woken. Rowan watched two of them from the window of a hotel room that Lucien had arranged, a floor-to-ceiling glass view of the financial district, and below, in the gray early light, she watched two black vehicles stop in front of a building she recognized from news photographs, and men she didn't recognize emerge from them and go inside and come back out with a man in a gray suit who walked without fighting it because he had understood, somewhere between the sub-basement and the morning, that fighting it was no longer a calculation that made sense. Martin Ashcroft. He looked smaller at 6 in the morning in the rain than he had looked at midnight in a cold storage room with 6 men behind him. Most things did. She had been awake the whole night. Not from anxiety exactly. Anxiety implied uncertainty, and the uncertainty was over. This was something else. The particular wakefulness of someone waiting for a process to complete that had been set in motion and could not be stopped. She had made tea at some point, and the mug was cold on the sill beside her. Eli was asleep on the couch behind her, fully clothed, his shoes still on, the way teenagers sleep when the adrenaline finally quits, sudden and total, like a switch thrown. She had covered him with the blanket from the bed without waking him. Seraphine was in the chair by the door. They hadn't talked again through the night, not at length. There would be time for that. Rowan had decided this somewhere around 3 in the morning, looking at the city lights blurring in the rain. There would be time for it, and it would not be easy, and it would not be fast. And the resolution was not a moment but a process, and she was at the beginning of the process rather than its end. She had accepted this and found it neither comforting nor devastating, just accurate. What she had noticed through the small hours was that Seraphine did not sleep, sat in the chair and did not sleep, and watched the door with the specific vigilance of someone who had been watching doors for 17 years and had not yet learned to stop. Rowan watched another car pull up below. Edrin Kalau arrived at the hotel at 7. He came with 2 men and a lawyer. An actual attorney, carrying a briefcase, looking like the morning had already been long, and he sat across from Seraphine in the hotel room and looked at her for a long time before he spoke. "The Kalau organization owes you a debt," he said. "I'm aware," Seraphine said. "The files named 6 of our peripheral contractors." He paused. "We're prepared to address that exposure cooperatively, full cooperation with federal oversight." His jaw moved. Edrin Kalau cooperating with federal oversight. He said it like a man tasting something foreign. "You understand what that costs." "I understand," she said. "I want it acknowledged." His eyes were steady on hers. "That the cost of your archive is not only Ashcroft's, it lands on everyone it lands on." "Yes," Seraphine said. "That was always true. The people who needed to be named, and some of the collateral was always going to fall on organizations that weren't the primary target." She paused. "I'm sorry for that specifically." "Don't be sorry. Just be accurate." He stood. "The debt to you stands. Your daughter walked into our event and was put in danger under our roof. That is also a debt." He looked at Rowan for the first time since entering the room, a long and level look. "Whatever you need in the next period, whatever the transition requires." He left. The lawyer stayed to deal with paperwork Rowan didn't fully understand, documents related to immunity frameworks and testimony coordination, and the federal process that was now, apparently, already underway based on the transmission recipients who had been making calls since 2 in the morning. Seraphine handled the paperwork. Her handwriting was neat and certain, the handwriting of a woman who had spent years creating documents that needed to be exact. Rowan went and stood beside Eli on the couch and watched him sleep. His face in sleep was the face she'd been watching for 14 years. The same face, just arriving incrementally into its adult shape, the jaw sharpening, the brow settling. He had their mother's forehead. She had known this abstractly and now knew it concretely, having seen both foreheads in the same room. She thought about the lamp on the kitchen counter at home, the electric bill, the shut-off notice propped against the sugar jar. She thought about the fact that she would go home today, and the notice would still be there, and the $42 would still be short, and the world did not restructure itself around the resolution of large things to accommodate the small, ongoing logistics of a life still in progress. She was going to have to call in to her other two jobs. She had not thought about this until now. She had missed a shift at the diner this morning. There would need to be an explanation, or there would not be a job to go back to, and the question of whether she was going back to that job, to the three-job existence, the second-hand heels, the careful invisible life, was not a question she had an answer to yet. She was not the same person who had walked into the Vescari estate last night. She didn't know what person she was instead. Lucian knocked on the open door of the connecting room at 8:30. He had changed his shirt, she didn't know how or from where, and his forearm was bandaged, and he was carrying coffee in 2 paper cups with the specific purposefulness of a man who did not know what else to offer and had decided that coffee was something. He held one out to her. She took it. They stood at the window together in a silence that was not uncomfortable. Below them, Blackridge was waking up into a version of itself it didn't know yet, the early commuters moving along streets that would feel different by the time they reached them on the return. "How many arrests?" she said. 11 confirmed as of an hour ago. More coming." He drank his coffee. The deputy commissioner resigned at 6:15. The senator's office released a statement saying he's cooperating voluntarily, which is the thing people say when they've calculated that the evidence means cooperation is the only remaining option. Ashcroft? In federal custody. No bail hearing until Monday. He paused. His attorney was on the phone before they put him in the car. That's the one constant. Men like Ashcroft always have an attorney on the phone within minutes. But the documentation your mother compiled is thorough in a way that makes attorney on the phone less useful than it usually is. He looked at the city. She built it to hold. She had 15 years. Yes. She held the coffee cup in both hands and felt the warmth of it against her palms and thought about Vera Callow, who had looked at her with warm eyes and told her things that were true enough to be convincing. "Vera?" she said. "She left the city last night. We don't know yet where she went." He paused. "She's not in the federal documentation. She wasn't named. She was always Edrin's, not Ashcroft's. She fed information back to Ashcroft's people to protect the Callow organization's exposure, but she wasn't part of the original conspiracy." He looked at his cup. "Edrin doesn't know, or has decided not to know. Those two things sometimes look the same." "Are you going to tell him?" "That's not my calculation to make." He looked at her profile. "What she told you about your mother, the biometric archive, the lineage key, that information was true. She fed you real information to direct you toward a specific outcome. She wanted the archive to open. She wanted Ashcroft gone. The method was your mother's. She just needed someone to pull the mechanism." He paused. "She used you. The outcome she was after happened to align with what you needed. That's a complicated kind of help." "Most help is." She looked at his forearm, the white bandage. "Kellner. He's with federal custody now. He'll be processed with the rest." A pause. "I hired him 4 years ago. He came with good references." "How does that feel?" He thought about it. Like the thing that happens when you've been in a certain kind of world long enough. You think you're reading people correctly. Sometimes you're not. He looked at the city. "It feels like a lesson I'd already learned and apparently needed to learn again." Below them, a news van was pulling up on the cross street, the first of what would be many. The city was beginning to understand the shape of its morning. "What happens to the Vescari organization?" she said. "That's a long conversation." He glanced at her. "The short version is that the archive names people the organization has worked with, not the organization itself. There is still exposure, there's always exposure. But cooperative engagement with the federal process creates a different set of options than resistance would. He paused. I spent most of last night on the phone establishing that cooperative engagement. And what does that mean practically? It means there are parts of the organization that don't survive this period. There are operations that stop. There are structures that, he paused, choosing words with care. There are structures that need to be different. He looked at the city with the expression of someone looking at a thing they have complex feelings about and have not fully processed. My father built something that worked for its time. The time has changed. She looked at him. At the careful architecture of his composure and the things visible underneath it to anyone paying attention, the weight of the night, the cost of the choice he'd made when he'd stepped between her and whatever Ashcroft had been reaching for in that basement. You could have handed me over, she said. At any point last night, Harwick made that offer. Yes. Why didn't you? He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the first news anchor was setting up on the cross street, the camera pointing at the federal building 2 blocks over. Because I've spent 4 years running an organization that operates on the principle that leverage is the only currency, he said. And last night I watched a woman with nothing, no leverage, no protection, no knowledge of what she was walking into, make every correct decision from pure necessity. He paused. That's worth something. I don't have a more calculated answer than that. She nodded slowly. Also, he said, with the controlled, almost smile she'd seen once before in the ballroom, brief and slightly against his will. You told me to, and you were right, and I have enough ego to make that uncomfortable to admit. She looked at him for a moment. Then she looked back at the window. I'm going to need to figure out what comes next, she said. Yes. I don't know what that is yet. No. He turned and set his coffee cup on the windowsill. But you have allies now who owe a debt. Use them or don't. That's yours to decide. He straightened. The Calloway offer was real. My offer, for what it's worth, is also real. The Viscari organization needs people who understand documentation and evidence and the architecture of information. What your mother built is a skill set. You have it by training or inheritance or both. You're offering me a job. I'm noting that one exists if you want it. He moved toward the door. I'm also noting that you have options that didn't exist yesterday morning, and that having options is different from knowing what to do with them, and that figuring out what to do with them is not something that needs to happen before noon. He left. She stood at the window with her coffee and the city waking up below her and Eli asleep behind her and her mother's quiet breathing from across the room. And she let herself be in the specific moment without converting it into the next thing yet. There would be a next thing. There would be testimony and process and the long machinery of consequence grinding through the names in the archive. There would be a conversation with her mother that would take months and would not always be clean and would arrive somewhere neither of them could see from here. There would be the question of what Eli needed and what she needed, and whether those things were the same or different and how to navigate the space between them. There would be the electric bill. She almost laughed at that. The electric bill, still sitting on the counter at home, still $42 short. The diner shift she'd missed. The second-hand heels she'd left somewhere in the Viscari estate, abandoned on a dark carpet when she'd needed to run. She finished the coffee. She went and sat on the edge of the couch beside Eli and put her hand on his shoulder and felt him breathe. He made a small sound and didn't wake. I'm here, she said quietly, not to him specifically, to the room, to the morning, to whatever version of herself was going to have to figure out what happened next. From the chair by the door, Seraphine looked at her daughter sitting in the pale morning light with her hand on her son's shoulder, and her expression did the thing expressions do when they have too many things in them to arrange into anything legible. Grief and relief, and the specific devastation of seeing clearly the cost of a choice you made and made anyway and will carry for the rest of your life. Rowan felt the look, did not turn toward it immediately, let it sit. Then, without turning, Are you hungry? A silence from the chair. Yes, Seraphine said. Me too. Rowan stood up. I'll order something. She crossed to the phone by the bed and picked it up and called down to the hotel kitchen and ordered breakfast for 4. And while she waited, she looked out the window at the city that was now irrevocably different from the city it had been at 7 o'clock yesterday evening, when a woman in second-hand heels had run for a bus that had already left without her. The pendant was still around her neck. She reached up and touched it once. The familiar edges of the phoenix, the wings spread mid-ascent, the stone warm now from being close to her skin. She had spent 26 years carrying her mother's secret without knowing it. A child courier for information she'd had no access to, no understanding of, no choice about carrying. She had been the key to an archive she didn't know existed, the biological mechanism of something enormous, the answer to a coded question that had been waiting 17 years for someone to ask it. She had not chosen any of that. What she had chosen was to keep moving, to keep showing up for Eli and Lamplight, to take the catering job because the electric bill needed paying, to walk through the grand doors of the Viscari estate with a silver tray and her chin level and her name badge crooked, invisible in the way she had made herself invisible to survive, and then to refuse to be invisible when the room fell silent and the most dangerous men in the city rose to their feet and stared. She had chosen that. The refusal. The steady eye contact, the flat voice saying, "My mother's gone, and there's a difference." She thought about all of this looking out at Blackridge in the morning light, the city going about its ordinary business over the top of its extraordinary morning, and she felt the shape of herself. Not the shape she'd carried in, worn thin and careful and accustomed to being the least important person in any room, but something that had formed in the hours since, something harder and less apologetic. Something that had been there all along underneath the second-hand heels and the electric bills and had just needed the right kind of pressure to surface. The food arrived 40 minutes later. She set it out on the table by the window and woke Eli by saying his name once, and he came up from sleep with the specific disorientation of someone whose morning context had shifted dramatically from what it usually was, and he sat at the table and looked at the food and looked at Seraphine and looked at Rowan and said nothing for a long moment. Then he picked up a fork. They ate. Outside, Blackridge continued its becoming. The news vans multiplied. The federal building filled with people arriving and leaving and arriving again. The city's morning reconfigured itself around a new shape, the way mornings always do, finding the ordinary in the extraordinary's aftermath, locating the rhythm of going forward because going forward is the only direction available. Inside the room, 3 people ate breakfast in the thin morning light, and none of them spoke very much. And the silence was not comfortable exactly, but it was shared, which was something. Which was, Rowan thought, looking at her brother's profile and her mother's hands, and the city waking below them, a beginning, not a clean one, not an easy one, but a beginning, which was what she had. The pendant caught the light from the window and held it for a moment. The phoenix, mid-ascent, wings spread, rising. And then she reached up and tucked it inside her collar, against her skin, where it had always been warmest. She picked up her fork, and she moved forward into the morning,